All right, we've got some breaking news. We now have in our hands the indictment of Jeffrey Epstein on sex trafficking charges. CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman is joining us now to talk about this. We just got this,
and
Ricky.
She's just going through it right now.
What are you learning in just the first couple of pages?
What we're learning is that they are talking about Jeffrey Epstein's activities as we thought back in the 2000s, particularly between 2002 and 2005, where they show his pattern of sexual abuse of young women. And what is noted is the details of the pattern. In addition, we know that there are people who have spoken with the government who are called Employee 2, Employee 3. These are people who worked for Mr. Epstein. And what they did in the process was that they scheduled appointments for these young girls to come into the residence. As I continue, there may be more of these people besides Employees 2 and 3.
It's very graphic.
Very graphic. What we're learning about the pattern is that he would find young girls, then he would pay them in cash. Initially, as we have thought and believed from what happened in Florida, they were scheduled to come to the mansion in New York City, in Manhattan, on the Upper East Side. They were told they were going to give a massage to Mr. Epstein. They were taken into a room with a massage table. They were then asked to be semi-nude or nude, and eventually they were then engaging in sexual acts with Mr. Epstein. And yes, they, according to the allegations are graphic indeed.
Do they talk about the ages of the girls?
Yes, they are under the age of 16, some under the age of 14, and the government claims in the indictment that they know that because there are many cases where he asked them their age, and they told their age.
Wow.
And that always becomes an element, you know, as to if a young girl, 14, 16, appears to be much older, how does someone know their age? It was one of the things that came up with R. Kelly that we know about. You know, how do you know they're underage? And Mr. Kelly's insisting that he never was with an underage girl. So you could only prove it up by the girl telling him that she is, in fact, underage. So my belief thus far, in reading about half of this, is that what we've learned is basically what we suspected we would learn. It's just, interestingly enough, for a short indictment, because as I said, as soon as I had it printed, it was thin. It's only 12 pages. But what it says in about the first 5 pages is enough for you to go, this is just a terrible human being.
And the fact that he didn't spend any real significant jail time the first time around is I think something that people different charge. And here, what they're saying, I'm looking through this, a couple of things. First of all, it says that Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, knew that many of his New York victims were underage, including because certain victims told him their age. So in the case of R. Kelly, he said, I didn't know. Right. That was the defense there. Here they're saying the victims told him. The other thing that was interesting, it says Epstein incentivized his victims to become recruiters by paying these victim recruiters hundreds of dollars for each girl they brought to Epstein. In doing so, Epstein maintained a steady supply of new victims to exploit.
Well, he pays for the young woman to come on her own. He always pays in cash. Then it's such an easy seduction, especially for a vulnerable young woman, a foster care young woman, a homeless girl, a runaway, because these are the people that these people prey upon. So if you come in and suddenly you're given a lot of cash for doing something which may be distasteful, but you don't even realize how distasteful it is sometimes when you're at that age, but it's money. And it's why sex trafficking is so prevalent, because a lot of these people here, they got to go home. They weren't put in some kind of enslavement as being sex trafficked. So that's cash. But then he continues on and says, if you bring me others, you're going to get more cash. So the incentivization to keep the pipeline going, because it sounds like from this indictment that Jeffrey Epstein was not satisfied with just having an underage girl. He wanted new new meat, as they say, all the time.
And the Miami Herald's coverage of this, which has been really extensive, you know, they speak to one of his initial victims who becomes a recruiter. And according to her, you know, she talks about tens, like, you know, so dozens of girls that over time that had been introduced to him. Should other people who were hanging out with Mr. Epstein back in those days be concerned about this indictment?
They might, depending on what they saw and what they were involved in. He had powerful friends. We know that, whether it's President Trump, former President Clinton, Prince Andrew, and many other people. You have to remember this was a very wealthy guy who knew how to be a good friend with a private plane to those in power, and he cultivated those in power. But those people may not have seen anything untoward, and they may not have participated in anything untoward. So you've got to get from level 1 to level 2.
Right.
You can't, just because you're friends with someone who's committing a crime involving underage girls, it doesn't mean that you know about it.
But so in the section that's labeled statutory allegations, it says this. This is on page 8, it was part and object of the conspiracy that Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, and others known and unknown would and did in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce recruit, entice, harbor, transport, provide, and obtain by any means a person and to benefit financially and by receiving anything about it. Essentially, is that what we're to take means that there are other people who may have been involved in this who are not named in this indictment, but that they're looking at?
Well, you may have other people involved in the sense of participation, but you may have other people involved in the sense of other employees or associates, not necessarily other participants. Because we know there's employee 2 and employee 3 who have said a great deal, but we also have minor victim 1, who appears on page 9, and of course, you've got employee 2 and 3. You also have employee 1, but you have minors who gave information and who obviously now are adults. I mean, we're talking about 2002 to 2005. So the reason, Vlad, for all of that language about transportation from state to state in interstate commerce is that's how you get federal jurisdiction. Ordinarily, this type of case would be a state crime if it were timely brought, but it becomes sex trafficking instead of statutory rape or abuse of a child, as depending on which state you're in, depending on how the statute reads. You get to federal court when you move them from state to state. So what he is doing is he and apparently others have transported people from New York to Palm Beach, from Palm Beach to New York and other places. But otherwise, if you kept this in one place, you might have some problem about interstate commerce.
So we talked earlier about the plea deal that he managed to hammer out in Florida, where he was basically charged with prostitution, basically charged like a John would be charged.
Correct.
And this is entirely different. Could you see, some sort of litigation related to that plea deal now that we know more about it? Or is everyone involved, the attorneys, everyone who hammered it out, are they essentially protected?
Well, what was interesting to me was I actually assumed that in light of the Miami Herald's reporting and the judge in the federal court in Miami being so irate, and appropriately so, about what had happened with this plea deal, that there would be more than just the Office of Professional Responsibility looking into now Secretary of Labor Alex Acosta's conduct as being U.S. Attorney back in the time that this plea bargain was worked out. But what I read, and I only have it as a secondary source because I read it online, is that as recently as a month ago, that Maine Justice has said that they were not going to reopen the 2008 plea deal. And that is I've only read it in one place. So I'm assuming it's correct, but I can't verify that it's correct. But if that's true, that's major disappointment to many of these victims from back in that day, unless they can qualify under the new case.
Well, we know that at about 11 a.m. Eastern Time, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York will be holding a press conference to go over the details of this indictment. So maybe that's going to be, well, certainly maybe not with regards to Congress and whether or not there's anything to be done about the Labor Secretary, but to understand a little bit more about this indictment and what it means.
I'm sure if they take questions, someone is going to ask them their opinion on how the case was handled in Florida.
They may avoid that. I mean, in their answer, we don't know. I don't think Congress can do anything about that 2008 indictment. I think that you're really dealing with Maine justice.
So meaning that if somebody was to say, look, the Labor Secretary who's part of this prosecution that rendered this verdict or rendered this sentencing that was, for all intents and purposes, basically a smack on the wrist. And the Congress wants to investigate a member of the president's cabinet, and
they can investigate, you know, till they're blue.
Right.
But the reality is, the remedy for this kind of situation rests with Maine justice, which is why I was very disappointed.
And he's not a member of the Justice Department anymore.
No. But what this really happens is the Office of Professional Responsibility is the only one that can do anything to him, unless the publicity becomes so overwhelming that perhaps for the good of the country, it becomes time for him to have a good talk with himself, his loved ones, and the president.
Well, I will say for Acosta says he was under, at the time, tremendous pressure. There were private investigators looking into the background of everyone involved. And so that is his sort of counter-argument.
Well, he has another counter-argument, which is he took this all the way up to a deputy attorney general at Maine Justice. I mean, he may have done the deal, but he couldn't do it without getting approval.
And why was it secret?
Well,
that's another good question.
I think the reason it was secret is simply because they knew how terrible it was. Yeah. They knew what outrage there would be. I mean, I've never heard of something like this happening in secret where victims are not told. So the only thing you can do is suspect the worst. Why else would it have been secret?
So, Ricky, what are the challenges moving forward with a trafficking case like this? Because there's been a span of time now, and, you know, the same challenges that were present back then are present now, in that, you know, the victims that were chosen, the alleged victims, whatever, however, the victims that were chosen were, you know, like you said, you know, kids who didn't have support, maybe foster kids, or I think one young woman, I think, was actually in sort of a halfway house at the time. And so those same sort of character issues, one could say, would still be present today.
They are. However, we have employee 1, 2, and 3. If you have people who worked for Mr. Epstein and they facilitated what was clearly sexual acts, with underage girls, you have corroborative evidence. So that makes a big difference. If you were only resting this case on the word now of someone who was 14 to 16 back then and now is a relatively mature young woman, that still, they would be vulnerable, completely vulnerable. I mean, you can see what's happened with particularly one of the victims who was in the Miami case, who has just been absolutely eviscerated in the public with motions filed both in Miami and New York about opening up the court papers and people claiming that she was a liar. You have to remember that Mr. Epstein, money gets good lawyers. Mr. Epstein has always had fine lawyers.
You know, we should point out that the reporter who's been tracking this story for quite some time is Julie Brown at the Miami Herald.
She's fantastic.
She's been doing incredible reporting. She has talked to dozens of alleged victims. And I saw an interview that she gave this morning on MSNBC where she said, where she talked about, you know, so somebody might say, well, why now? You know, that's always the argument when things that were adjudicated come back up, and people say, well, why are they doing this now? And she says that, you know, many of the victims who were underage at the time are now adults. Many have married, many have lives, they have children, and one of the anecdotes that she gave is one of the victims has a daughter and does not want to see what happened to her happened to her daughter or somebody else's daughter. And so all of a sudden, in the time that we're living in now in 2019, the circumstances of our days, they feel it's the right moment to come forward and say, this happened to me. And she has been following the story. The journalism that she's been doing has been consistent. She's never let this go because she as most reporters sometimes feel, you want to bring justice for the victims, and finally, this is starting to gain some traction.
Well, I think, first of all, her interview that we both saw this morning, I thought was really enlightening. She's tenacious, and she wants to make a difference. It's the ultimate thing that could happen to a journalist, where your reporting can really shake the earth. And here, what we see in this day and age is what is now considered an act of bravery or courage on the part of a female victim in those days would have been considered an admission of shame. Totally changed.